intricacies of the dual signature system, which is currently being standardized for credit card payments. As I pointed out, this is not yet entirely used everywhere, but it is expected that it will be used soon. So, I am giving you an idea of what this standard, which is going to be adopted all over the world, is going to be, and that is dependent on what is called as a dual signature. The primary purpose of a dual signature is, as I pointed out, that as far as the vendor with whom an order has been placed is concerned, there is no need for him to know the credit card number. He has to know only what is being purchased and what is the amount of purchase. Similarly, the acquirer need not know the actual items which are purchased. He needs to know only the credit card number and the total amount which has got to be paid by the customer. So that he can check whether the credit card number is a legal number and whether the credit card owner has enough balance to be able to pay that amount of money which is given in the purchase order. So, the whole idea of the system is to make it such that the purchaser essentially has to, of course, put the credit card number plus the purchase order plus which consists of two parts, namely the items we purchased and the amount of the order. So, that has got to be split into two parts. So, when the customer gives this in his computer, the two parts are split. One is the purchase amount plus purchase order plus amount, that is what are all the items he is going to purchase plus the amount, and the credit card number and the amount. These two are two separate entities which are sent to different people, but there is need for both of them to be available together for dispute resolution. In other words, tomorrow there is a dispute by the customer saying that he did not really order these items, but he has been charged, then there must be some proof saying that he did order those items. Okay. And that is the reason why that there is a need for this in some encrypted form to be available with the acquirer, so that any kind of a dispute settlement can take place. Same way, it has got also to be available in an encrypted form which cannot, of course, be read by the vendor to be with him. So, that is the whole idea. Now, the purchase order plus amount is hashed with some kind of a hashing function, which we said was a MD5, or essentially it is an abstract of the order by a good hashing algorithm, which is unique and which is also standard algorithm. Okay. And so, it is agreed on standard algorithm between all concerned in this electronic commerce. And so, he hashes this because signature really normally consists of the hashes which are encrypted with a private key of the customer. So, that is the reason why it is hashed. And from POD, the POD goes to the hands of the acquirer. From this, he cannot find out what is the exact items purchased, because it is a hash. It is already been kind of abstracted, and it is another binary string, which is, of course, there is a one-to-one correspondence between this and this, but you cannot go backwards from POD to POA. In other words, this forward you do by hashing, but you do not have a backward hash which is available. Okay. So, similarly the credit card number and the amount is hashed, and CCD comes out of this hashing function. So, this has got to go to the bank, this has got to go to the merchant. Anyhow, these two are essentially concatenated. That means they are putting, if there are binary strings, this string and this string are joined together. That is what is known as concatenation. and the symbol which is used for concatenation is as parallel double lines. Okay. So, POD is concatenated with CCD and again hashed to give a PPD, and this PPD, the reason why it is concatenated and again hashed is that the PPD effectively contains this information, POA information, as well as CC information. Okay. So, PPD is the one which really will bind the customer with the entire order, because here actually the order has been split into two parts. Okay. So, the entire order, essentially the information is contained in this, that is encrypted by the private key of the customer, and this is called the dual signature, and this dual signature is the one which is verified by the acquirer before he how can he verify it? What he can do is, of course, he will have the public key of the customer. So, from that he can get hold of PPD, and if he has got PPD available with him, then of course he knows that that could have come only from the customer because it has been signed by his private key. Okay. The customer's public key of course is available with both the acquirer and the merchant or the vendor, whatever you might call. Okay. So, I am essentially calling POA as purchase order plus amount, and purchase order digest. There is the actual hash function is called digest, and credit card and amount and credit card digest, and concatenated values POD, PCCD, PPD, and then there is private key. Okay. Now, the steps are, let us go through the steps first. Okay. So, the purchase order amount is encrypted by the public key of the merchant's public key, and sent to the merchant. The reason why it is encrypted, because I am going to send it through internet, and it has got to be encrypted so that no hacker gets hold of it, and the merchant of course can decrypt it using his private key and get the purchase order and the amount, and the credit card number and the amount is encrypted by the acquirer's public key. Okay. Or you might say the bank's public key. Bank, I am essentially assuming the bank and acquirer are somewhat same, in this context. Okay. It does not really matter. The acquirer is also a bank, but of course it is not the same bank as which issued the credit card to the customer. So, this is encrypted by the acquirer's public key, and this of course can be decrypted by the acquirer by using his private key, and he will get the credit card number and amount separately from that. Okay. And because he knows what are the, they will check the credit card number, and he will look at the amount and see whether it is within the credit limits of the customer. Along with that, the digital signature is also sent to him, and then the CCD is the digest of CCA, that is also sent to him. So, these are all sent to the merchant, because the merchant will have this available to him. He cannot decrypt it because it is encrypted with the acquirer's public key, and his private key is not available to the merchant. But then this is only for legal purposes later on to say that this is what anyhow this is what is going to forward to the acquirer, and also for legal purposes that it is actually came to him, and anybody can, the bank can definitely decrypt it. Okay. And the merchant sends the CCA encrypted and digital signature and the POD, that is the purchase order digest, to the acquirer. Purchase order digest is this one which is digested, that is in other words hashed. Okay. Acquirer sends CCA, that is the one way you can look at it is acquirer sends the whole thing as it is to the bank, and the bank decrypts it, finds out the credit card number and amount, sees if it is okay, computes the hash of, because CCD which it has got, okay, and the POD. So this hash will give the idea for dispute resolution, decrypts DS with customer's public key, and finds out whether these two are equal. If these two are equal, that means it is actually a signed one. Okay. Now CCD of course is available with the CCD has been sent to the bank by the because once the CCA is sent, the digest can be found out to get the CCD, and then POD has been sent. So CCD concatenated with POD can always be found. Okay. So this way you can hash it, because the hashing algorithm is a standard MD5 algorithm, and so you can compare the hashed function with this, and they two match. You know that it is a correctly signed copy. Okay. So okay, the acquirer of credit and signature are okay. Okay, the merchant if it is if the credit is there, because actually the bank tells the acquirer in turn tells the merchant. Merchant finds the this POD, that is the POD concatenated to CCD, hashes this, finds PPD, decrypts DS with public key of customer, and matches whether this and that DS verified match. Then if the signature matches here also, then of course he will send the delivery details and bill to customer. Of course, the double check which is taking place. One is the check by the bank whether it is properly signed, and also merchant checking whether it is properly signed. It's a kind of a dual kind of signature verification, because both of them have to be convinced that it is properly signed. Okay, because later on there shouldn't be a dispute between the merchant and the bank and the acquirer. Okay, so this is a whole. So there are 7 steps in this process, and this is the 7 steps which I have shown in this picture here. This is the customer sending the purchase order which is stripped, and then this goes to acquirer sends to bank checks and okays payment, and this informed to the merchant checks the signature, sends it to the customer, and ultimately of course the bank will send the customer a full bill at the end of each month. Okay. So this is essentially the method which is used for check payment. Okay. So no, I am sorry, this is the method which is used for the dual signature method which is used for credit card payment. So we said that there are 4 payment methods. One is the credit card payment, the other is the check payment, the third one is small amounts in terms of information goods, like a few pages of an article or a music track and things like that. And lastly, of course, cash payment. Cash payment is the most challenging of the lot. So let us look at the check payment. Check payment is normally the one used in B2B e-commerce, because normally two businesses, when they become partners in e-commerce, the two businesses will have a trusted relationship with one another, and because they are businesses, they normally have to essentially pay through checks, which is legally required, particularly if the amount is above a certain value. By and large in B2B commerce, amounts are fairly large. They are not small amounts like 100 rupees or 200 rupees. It is normally much larger. And of course, credit cards could also be used, but normally they are not used for very large amounts. Okay, and they use for small amounts. But then credit card, when you issue to a bank, there is always a question of who is the authorized person to use it and so on and so forth. Okay. So, but there is check also, there will be some kind of an authorized person to issue the check, and that is essentially the most common means of transacting business to business e-commerce. That is the primary method of payment. Okay. Most check based transactions will be, as I said, between businesses. very often a special hardware is attached to PC to sign those payments. Of course, again we will be using the public key private key pair, and it could effectively be done by a software running the computer, or because we are paying a large number of transactions or e-transactions and large number of checks are being paid, then it may be more economical and faster to have some kind of a hardware means of signing, and this hardware means of signing also can be kind of controlled. In other words, not everybody can essentially have the authority to send a check. So the hardware will be with the person who is authorized to send checks and so on and so forth. Okay, and so normally signature is encrypted by the hardware. Okay, so the encryption of the signature using the private key of the authorized person. The private key would possibly be stored in the hardware device, and that is the one which effectively will do the it's a special purpose, you might say small computer to do that. Okay, all public keys of business partners authenticated by certifying agencies. As I pointed out, certifying agencies are necessary to be able to make sure that businesses do exist. Of course, if two businesses decide to kind of become partners in e-commerce, then they would both exchange the digital certificates, and so they convince one another of their legal presence before they transact business of huge amounts and so on and so forth. So the purchaser sends a purchase order and payment advice signed with his private key to the vendor. Okay, he also sends his public key certificate encrypted with vendor's public key to the vendor. As usual, there is the private key is actually it's a signed purchase order, and the public key certificate is sent so that when the vendor decrypts with the public key, which is a legal public key and belongs to this particular person, then he can get back the purchase order and amount. And of course, he can also verify the signature, the usual method of verifying signature, namely a digest can be sent, and but also in the sense that the sign, when I say signed the private key, effectively means it's a digest which has been encrypted. Okay, that is a signature. The order itself, okay, order itself along the purchase order means the items which is being ordered plus the agreed on cost of each item, total cost, they together really constitute the purchase order. That will be encrypted with the vendor's public key, so that the vendor receives that, he can use his private key to decrypt it and get the entire purchase order. Signature, of course, means that you are taking the digest of that, and then the purchaser encrypts it with his private key, so that the other side, namely the vendor, can decrypt and make sure that the purchase order which came, its digest and the decrypted digest match. In this case, there is the authentication of the signature is done, and authentication of the purchase order is done. So tomorrow there can't be a dispute saying that I did not send the purchase order, because it's a signed digest which is there. The digest was actually compared. And vendor decrypts the private key and checks certificate, and also the check is also sent. I mean, in other words, there are two ways in which one can send payment. One way is that first you send the purchase order, is accepted and all that, and then goods are supplied, and after goods are supplied, then only the check is paid, because the check is paid based on what is accepted. There is a goods which may come, then, as I have been pointing out from the beginning, will be sent for inspection, and after inspection, the rejected goods no payment will be made. Only for accepted goods the payments will be made. So the accepted goods and their cost and the total amount is the one which has got to be sent by a check. So and so in order to send the check, what do? See, check will consist of two parts. One is the authorization for payment. So normally when we send a check in a manual system, what do? We write out the name of the party concerned to whom it is payable, mark it account payee, and then enter the amount of the check and sign it at the bottom. Okay, that is a physical system. In this system, equivalently, what should be done is that the check amount, the name of the recipient, or in this case it could be a code for the recipient. There is a vendor code, maybe the one which is agreed on between the two. So the code of the recipient plus of course the name of the recipient, both together, plus the amount, and you may attach this check also at the top of it the items for which the payment is being made. So this entire document essentially may be thought of as a e-check. There is the accepted items list with the agreed on pricing, total amount, and the total amount along with the vendor's name and code, and this is the total document is digitally signed. So what is meant by digitally signed is that this document is sent encrypted with the public key of the vendor. So you can decrypt and look at the entire thing. Along with it, a digest is made using MD5, and that digest is encrypted to the private key of the purchaser. So when it gets there, that can be decrypted by the public key of the purchaser by the vendor, and he can also create independently a digest from the purchase order, the entire amount which came there with the check amount which is there, and if these two match, then he knows that it is legally signed, and that will stand up in a court of law. So once it is signed, of course the public key certificate is sent by the purchaser if it is not already exchanged and so on. Okay, once it is done, then there is a bank, and then now what the vendor will do is that once he gets authentication about the signature, he will send the entire thing to the bank, and normally the purchaser also will send to the bank the signed copy of the purchase order. Okay, and so that the bank can check whether this check is a valid check or not. So it will, when it decrypts the private key, check certificate and check, attaches deposit slip along with the check, encrypts the bank's public key and sends it to the bank. He also sends the bank his public key certificate. There is one kind of an exchange between two businesses of exchanging their public keys. Here also, if the vendor has a banker, there is no need to exchange the public key certificate every time between the vendor and the bank, because the bank and the vendor have got a trusted relationship. So from the vendor, if it comes with the vendor's code number, automatically the bank will know it is from the particular vendor. So it will do the decryption and find out the check value, and for later on dispute resolution, it will also have a copy of the certificate, which is this certificate, that is signed one from the vendor, from the purchaser. That of course may or may not be here, but it's up to what kind of protocol the three parties seem to use, because now what he will do, this bank will do is encrypts the bank's public key and sends the so the bank, once it comes, the check comes with the payment slip or deposit slip, it will decrypt it, checks the signature and credits and clears the check. what is meant by clearing the check is that the check has to be sent to a clearing organization. Checks are all cleared. In other words, two different banks. See, what happens is this check is issued in the name of some vendor. So the vendor has to deposit in his bank, but his bank in turn has to collect the amount from the issuer of the check, which is the purchaser, and purchaser may have an account in a different bank. So check may be on a different bank. So what the person will do, this bank will do, is that there is a central clearing agency to which all banks send checks which emanate from different other banks. If it is their own branch, there is no problem. Immediately they will do the debit and credit. Otherwise, it goes to a clearing agency. In India, the check clearing agency is the Reserve Bank of India, which is an apex body, which has the responsibility of also dispute resolution and so on and so forth. And so both the banks will send it. Any bank which has a check issued in another bank's name, they will send it to the clearing agency, and they will in turn get it cleared by the bank which is supposed to pay, and then credit the account of this bank. Okay, all these of course done electronically at a reasonably fast speed. Nowadays clearing is all electronic. Okay, and the intermediary is only to keep things somewhat honest in terms of the any disputes between the two banks and so on and so forth. Okay, so and the credit advice goes to the vendor once it is credited, and consolidated debit advice is sent to the purchaser periodically by his bank. In other words, the bank, because ultimately the clearance the money has been taken away from his account, and so he gets a consolidated statement of saying these are all the checks he issued, these are all the payments have been made, so he can check that against whatever he has been issuing, so that there is no possible dispute which may arise. So effectively this is the way in which it goes. The purchaser sends an order and signs it and puts it in a so-called secure envelope. That means it is encrypted on this order, check, signature, certificate, all of them go together, and here it is vendor verifies the signature and deposits this check, signature, certificate, endorsement, everything, his endorsement to deposit, and it goes to the vendor's bank, and of course he signs it in turn, so that there is no dispute between these two. Okay, and the vendor's bank will send the credit advice when it has been created. The vendor will go to the clearing house, and clearing house will send to the purchaser's bank, and that will in turn to the debiting. Okay, because I have not shown the signing and all that here, which is actually implied. In other words, whenever there is an electronic transaction between two boxes here, they have to go through the entire motion of encryption, signing, and so on, just to make sure that any kind of a hacking on the transmission lines here are avoided. Of course, it may, in some countries, these lines may be entirely private lines, because there is a huge number of money transactions which goes on between clearing houses and banks, and if this gets hacked, there will be a very serious consequences. That is the reason why in many countries there is a dedicated line, so that there is nobody can hack this, and so there is no need for things like encryption, signature, and so on. Okay, and so this is the way in which the ultimate balance, everything goes on. So the point really is that there are the purchaser as well as the vendor have to be able to sign, and they got their own. When I mean by signature card is nothing but a small piece of hardware. Of course, it could be a software also, which effectively does the digital signing. And secure envelope means all these are put together and then encrypted. Okay, through the public key of this person. Now the next payment means I am going to talk about is something called, it's actually a proprietary system. It is not something which is accepted all over the world, okay, and it is not actually available in many places. It's available in USA, and it is actually administered by a company called NetBill, and they got a system to which one can subscribe to be able to pay and get information goods. What is meant by information goods are, as I said, maybe articles, there is a text file of some type, or it could be a music file, or it could be a video file. It does not matter what file it is, because they are all ultimately they are all bit strings. Okay. So the primary purpose of this, first of all, the amount which is involved in this is not very large. It will be in US dollars, maybe a few dollars. In Indian rupees, maybe less than 100 rupees or a few hundreds maximum. So normally credit cards are used for amounts in excess of normally 500 rupees or so. Smaller amounts, the transaction cost of the credit card can be quite large. That is, it has to go through all this dual signature and stuff like that. So each transaction will cost a lot of money, and that is the reason why for small payments for information goods and so on, credit cards are not normally used. Of course, there are new methods that are coming with debit cards and so on, but by and large the overheads are there, and that is the reason why this company finds it profitable, and people are willing to kind of pay them, because credit card companies, as I said, survive on late payments and so on, because they charge interest on late payments. That is what makes up for their total expenses, and besides that they have a yearly subscription. This will be much smaller amounts which are involved. So the primary interesting parts of this system is that customers charge only when the information is delivered. There is and also the customer is satisfied with the information. But that is, in other words, satisfied in the sense that he gets what he has ordered and not something else. Okay. Vendor is guaranteed payment when information is delivered. Okay. The vendor, he has to be sure that if he delivers some, say, music file, he does get paid. Okay. So that is also ensured, and NetBill is intermediary. Major steps are the following. When customer accepts quote for information, vendor sends encrypted information without the key to the customer. Okay. So it is actually encrypted using some kind of a symmetric key encryption, because in this case the items are not of great value, so no hacker will be really interested, unlike huge payments of checks and so on, because this is as I said, few dollars, or maybe less than 100 rupees or a few hundred rupees. People are not interested to go through all that difficulty to do hacking and so on. Okay. So by and large it uses symmetric key. When customer accepts quote for information, so in other words the vendor sends encrypted information without key to the customer, and payment order sent to the vendor with a checksum of information obtained. In other words, what is meant by that is that when as I pointed out here, the steps are the first customer orders from the let us just look at the steps. In other words, this is the way in which they say customer requests information. Okay, customer requests information, that is step 1, and so he will send his request for information, and the vendor will quote, saying that this is going to cost you this much money. Suppose he orders a particular track of music. For that track, this vendor will give a quote, and then when the quote is accepted, the order comes from the customer to the vendor. The order means he has accepted the quote, the price is fixed, and so it is actually the order acceptance goes in step 3. And step 4, once the order is accepted, he sends encrypted text or encrypted music file to the customer. The customer does not get the file right away, because only after he makes a payment he will get the actual he can actually use it. So the customer, as I said, the 4th is encrypted text goes from vendor to the customer. Now the vendor will send the customer bill. There is amount which he is supposed to pay plus key to decrypt that particular information, because it is encrypted with a symmetric key. So he will give the key to the NetBill server. NetBill is intermediary, okay, and this NetBill server will first check whether the customer has got enough credit. So what does it imply? It implies that the customer as well as the vendor have some account with the NetBill. So the customer essentially purchases, you might say, or pays some amount, say maybe a deposit of a couple of $100 or 500 rupees equivalent, say maybe approximately 500 rupees for the items he intends to purchase. And so there is a credit here. So NetBill actually gets the money ahead of time. It actually debits, because it gets the money ahead of time, and there will be an interest on that money. That is a kind of, you might say, interest value out of which it makes its profit. Otherwise, for each transaction, no payment is made by a customer, but vendor may have to pay some kind of a commission to NetBill, because NetBill is going to pay him the money. So for each transaction, the vendor may have to give a certain little royalty or maybe commission to the NetBill. So it will collect commissions from the vendor, and of course debit this deposit also will give you a certain amount of you might say short-term interest, and these two together is what supports NetBill's business model. Okay, so the customer sends a bill of the vendor sends a bill, customer's bill plus the key to decrypt to the NetBill server, and if the NetBill finds out that the customer has got enough credit in with the NetBill's account, then he will send an OK to the vendor. Okay, and when he sends OK to the vendor, saying that the transaction has been accepted, and so I am going to supply the key to the customer. When the key goes to the customer, the customer can decrypt this whatever came to him encrypted with the key, decrypt this with the key, and hear the music or read the text material, whatever it is. And once the key is sent, the transaction is complete as far as the customer is concerned and NetBill is concerned. So it will actually OK. Once it is OK, the vendor is expected to pay that commission, whatever is commission, to pay to NetBill. Okay, and this transaction is now closed. Okay, so each transaction goes through this. So that is essentially what I am writing in words. Payment order sent to vendor with check sum of information obtained, signed by the customer. Okay. Vendor sends NetBill's copy of purchase order and key for decryption. net bill checks credit a customer, OK sends key to customer, credit vendor's account and debits customer account, key sent to customer, decrypt information. Customer decrypts information. That is essentially the same steps. Okay, now the only question which question one might ask is the payment order is sent to the vendor with checksum information obtained. It is signed by the customer. What is meant by that? Okay. Now the purchase order, okay, number there is a request for information. There is number step 3, which is the purchase order. Okay, the purchase order is sent checksum. The checksum means effectively it is a hashed whatever is received at this time. He has to get the customer signs this purchase order, because that is obvious, and now the payment order is sent to the checksum. That is primarily for dispute resolution, which is later on if there is any kind of dispute that can be resolved. Okay. But the primary steps are these, okay, which I explained in fairly great detail. Okay. Now the last part is electronic cash payment. The cash payment is a very tricky affair, because cash preserves anonymity. There is suppose I pay, the cash is, see the cash or the currency notes are issued by a central agency like Reserve Bank of India. Reserve Bank of India is the one which prints notes and puts in circulation. Okay, and of course this the fact that that piece of paper whose intrinsic value is nothing still has a value to purchase comes from the fact that there is a undertaking by the Reserve Bank that I pay the bearer on demand so much of money. In the earlier days, whenever a bank, Reserve Bank of a country, was issuing checks or issuing currency notes, they are supposed to have gold reserves equal to that currency note which they give out. So gold reserves were essentially expected to be there to kind of guarantee that the currency notes which are being printed have any value at all. But nowadays, of course, that gold standard, which is used to be called gold standard, is gone, and instead they got some kind of a international monetary fund which kind of looks at credits and debits, balance of payments and so on, and then the value of various currencies float with respect to some standard currencies, namely that currently the standard currencies are US dollars and euros and yen, okay, because they are strong economies. Whatever it is, I mean that is the way it is today, okay. But whatever, as far as general public is concerned, that that even though RBI is the one which is printing those, but I actually transact business, I don't have to tell RBI what transaction is taking place. Once it is issued, you have a bank, you have cash, a rupee note. That rupee note is anonymous. Who has it? Nobody knows. Okay. So if I borrow 100 rupees from my friend, nobody need to know except myself and my friend. Okay. And so that is the advantage, anonymity of cash. There is also a disadvantage which the governments are worried about, because large cash payments is called black money. Okay, does not go through banking channels and so on. So black money or lots of cash is actually used by for illegal means, like for instance drug trafficking or terrorism and stuff like that. That's why countries are very averse to kind of issuing even currency notes beyond a certain value. In India, for instance, only recently they started issuing 1000 rupee notes. That is the highest currency note you can, which is issued. The reason why the value is kind of kept at a ceiling is that to transport huge amounts of cash, volume is very high, and you can't smuggle it through customs and so on. People will find out when you are smuggling cash from one place to the other. Whereas in electronic cash, the electronic cash can flow through internet without anybody knowing, and internet does not understand national boundaries. With the result that it is very governments are very wary of allowing cash transactions, which are anonymous transactions over the internet, particularly of cash. So it should be traceable. See, cash is a real value of cash is not traceable, whereas electronic cash, the government don't like non-traceable cash. They want it to be traceable. So we will only discuss traceable cash. But of course, there have been protocols which have been invented to make transactions anonymous on the net. There are algorithms which are there. There is one algorithm by Chaum, which is for anonymous transactions and so on. But it is not normally used because legally it is not allowed. So in this case, it's traceable cash. So that means, what is meant by traceable cash are two things. The anonymity means that if I purchase some items from a shop with cash, and as far as the shop is concerned, I am a anonymous body. I paid for the goods and I have gone away. And tomorrow, if you ask him who paid, if it is like if I bought some saris and so on, I may have paid 5,000 rupees for a sari, but to say who paid 5,000 and who bought this sari, very difficult for that person to find out, because very often he will issue a cash memo, not even put the name, okay, because he's got cash, so it's a cash memo, and he clears it, okay. And so nobody really asks for a name of a person unless it is a goods which has a guarantee and stuff like that. So that is the whole point, okay. In the case of the electronic cash, it is traceable. Actually, in this case also it is not anonymous. So customer withdraws coins, again it's for small payments only, because as I said, governments don't like large payments, large cash payments. Customer withdraws coins in various denominations signed by a bank. There is a bank is an issuer of this currency, just like Reserve Bank issues currency notes of various denominations. There are certain designated banks which deal with electronic cash. So they will essentially issue some tokens, you might say. Each token will say this is 1 rupee, and it will be signed by the bank's digital signature, and 5 rupee, 10 rupees, 15 rupees, 20 rupees, whatever, okay. And it's got a serial number, denomination, and signature of the bank. So these three are there in each token. Bank stored, and it stores all the issued coins, so that it can to whom it is issued, and so it got to debit that person when he purchases some goods. So it requires the to store it for debiting. Customer pays vendor using the signed coins, okay. So again electronically, okay. Bank checks whether this current or spent. In other words, the vendor will send that signed coins to the bank, and the bank will see whether it is already spent. If it is already spent, means it has already been encashed. That's why it keeps this complete database of what it is issued. If what is issued, it will check whether this coin which has been given by the vendor is issued, has been already used or not used. If it is not used, that means he will allow the authorized dispatch of goods and credits vendor's account with electronic coins, and the vendor sends the item to the customer, and the bank will actually remove this coin you might say the signed coin from the credit of the purchaser who has bought these. So it can't be used again because it's been taken away from the database. Okay. So primarily the steps are withdraws cash. Cash in this case are many denominations signed by the bank. Okay, and he pays with this cash, and the vendor sends it to the bank, and vendor bank checks and says it's whether it's okay or not. It is whether a spent coin or unspent coin. Once it gets an okay, and the bank essentially will the vendor will send back the items to him, and of course the bank will pay the vendor the amount. Okay, so this is a whole set of things which go on. Okay, this is a cycle, and I have not spent too much time on this for the simple reason that it is not all that popular yet. Okay, and because by and large small cash payments people physically go to the shop and buy. Electronically they don't really do much cash transactions. Okay, but it's interesting nevertheless how you try to mimic cash. In fact, books have been written on this. There is a book called Electronic Money which discusses all about what cash implies in the case of electronic commerce. Okay, and there are a number of interesting articles that have been written and so on. In fact, an entire issue of one of the IEEE transactions on a computer was issued to electronic cash to discuss all the nuances of electronic cash, because it's one of the, you might say, the last goalpost which people in e-commerce are looking for. But then of course there are roadblocks because of the problems with governments in general. Now this kind of concludes the what I have been talking about in electronic commerce. Now there are a couple of things I would like to talk about in the remaining time. One is emerging areas in electronic commerce. What is meant by emerging areas is what is in the horizon, what is slowly coming, and maybe in next 5 years or so what will become very prevalent and common, and you as a student what you should be looking for in terms of the newer emerging technologies and keep up with those emerging technologies. One thing which is very interesting which is happening is what is called mobile commerce, or abbreviated as m-commerce. The name mobile commerce implies that the commerce is between mobile devices, and wherever the mobile device has got an important bearing. As you know very well, mobile devices have become very common. Today in India, for instance, the number of mobile phones which have been given to customers exceeds the number of fixed phones. Previously the number of fixed phones was the major item, but mobile phones are almost, I think, double the number of fixed phones. That means people are always in the move, and people are always using their mobile phones for various purposes. And of course, besides the talking on the mobile phone, as you know, mobile phones have become so powerful. You normally can send SMS messages. SMS is very commonly used because it's a very inexpensive way of communicating. Plus, of course, you can take a photo on the mobile phone, and you can even transmit a photo, and so on. So this is the you might say mobility has become important. Apart from mobile phones, there is something called PDAs, that is personal digital assistants, which are also connected to the cellular phone system. And with the mobile phone, there is something called wireless application protocol which is coming for communicating with the mobile phone with the internet, which is different from the TCP/IP protocol. TCP/IP protocol assumes that the devices are PCs which are connected to the internet. So Actually, in the TCP/IP protocol, the message is cut up into small parts and sent. They are assembled, but the TCP's function is to make sure that all the packets have come and they have been assembled in the right way, and that it is complete message. Whereas in WAP or wireless application protocol, they don't do this checking because the bandwidths are more expensive. Also not as much as in fixed devices, even though that is changing. So there is a wireless application protocol which is used. So that is number one. Now the question one might ask is, why would anybody think of mobile commerce when you have got your PC and in fact you have a mobile PC, in the sense that there are Wi-Fi's are available everywhere, airports and hotels and so on, and you have wireless connection with the telephone, with the laptop, with the telephone line. So that of course is part of the internet. You can connect your personal computer to the internet and you can transact business and so on. That is not really mobile commerce. Mobile commerce is, by implication, something to do with the cellular phone network, which is used by cell phones and so on, and PDAs and whatnot. Okay, so the basic difference between cell phones and PCs, as PDAs and PCs, that cell phones, the screen is very small, and also the keyboard is very small, and the processor there is much less powerful than a PC. So you got to have methods which are appropriate for that. So that is a challenge. And currently, the two major applications of wireless or mobile e-commerce are, number one is in supply chain management. As I said, supply chain management is one of the major applications of e-commerce, where you want to kind of order items from multiple vendors and do it in reasonably fast time, so that you totally be able to reduce the delays. So in the mobile commerce, what happens is you are able to track the movement of items through, on a truck or a plane and so on. Each packet will have something called a radio frequency identification tag, or RFID tag, which effectively gives a radio frequency identification. So if I have a reader, it will tell me it will track the item exactly where it is. So when I am able to track the item continuously where it is, I can predict much better when it will come to me. Suppose I very urgently require one, the vendor may divert something on the way from one purchaser to the other purchaser, because one purchaser there is no very urgent need. So this kind of what is meant by mobile tracking is one, tracking of items and then rerouting of items and so on. And for similarly, another very interesting application which people are using is in terms of suppose you are traveling and you want to find out the nearest shop, and using a global positioning system on the mobile device, it will give you a little map and say where you are compared to this shop. So again, you can go to that shop or restaurant and so on. So these are all the emerging applications of mobile commerce, and so you will see that the next 5 years or so, this is going to become a very important area which will be appended to the e-commerce. And so one has to look at new protocols, new methods, and new applications, new business models and so on. And I think it's going to be very exciting in this mobile kind of commerce area. So with this, we are stopping this discussion of electronic commerce, and I will go on with the rest of the topics. Two more primary modules are left in the next two lectures.